All right, we are about 2 minutes past the hour. Appreciate everyone joining us today. So this is the second of our three-part webinar series on Azure Sentinel. In the last session, we kind of did a really solid foundational subset of kind of what Sentinel is, how to use it, kind of going over some of the high-level functions. Our next two here are going to be going much deeper into the solutions. One of the immediate things you'll notice today is there is going to be almost no slideware. Today will be almost all hands-on demonstration, working in the data, etc. So we have probably about 8 slides, but again, the rest of today will be primarily working in specifically in Playbooks. So for those that didn't attend the last session, or for those that didn't get the intro, my name is Rich Lilly. I'm a partner and associate director with Metrics. I run our cloud infrastructure and security team. One of our broader M365 security SMEs as a whole, and one of my babies here really is Azure Sentinel. I'm really a big believer of it. I'm really pushing this with a lot of customers and having a lot of great success. Today's specific session is we're going to be focusing in on my favorite topic, which is SOAR. For those that don't know, SOAR is Security Orchestration Automation and Response. And really the goal here is to focus in on topics that we can automate to help improve the life of a SOC analyst. So anything that an analyst would typically do that requires multiple manual tasks, we want to be able to leverage tools within the Microsoft suite of products to better automate actions, right? Whether it be a one-time action, whether it be a repetitive action, and even actions at scale. So a lot of what we're going to focus in on today is going to be really talking about how we can leverage this concept of playbooks to help us from an incident management security operations perspective. So just again, a couple of things I'm going to re-hit on again for those that didn't attend the last session. I promise not to go through again all the slides here. I just have a couple. What we're focusing in on kind of the traditional challenge side today is a couple of areas. So one is the deployment maintenance of the solution and how playbooks can help there. Also the rising infrastructure costs. So, typically this also relates back to bodies, which is also the one on the bottom right there, which is the security skills are difficult to find. It's difficult for me to find someone that's very strong and working in, APIs or PowerShell or .NET or Node.js. So being able to offer up capabilities to work in a nice, easy way for automation is one of the key things we'll cover today. And then also one of the biggest challenges is just lack of automation. So kind of those four or five bubbles I talked about there will all relate back to our topic today around SOAR. And a lot of this is, again, really powered by both the SOC as well as the cloud and AI term that everyone loves to use today. Fundamentally, though, the things we'll focus in on today on kind of the traditional security operations team is, again, trying to really remove those repetitive tasks that are manually done today. From that perspective, in the last presentation, we covered off on some of the different integrations at a very, very high level. So what we're going to focus in on today very heavily is a lot of those pre-wired integrations that Microsoft has. So a couple of things to know about right out of the gate when we talk about this concept of playbooks or SOAR within Sentinel. How SOAR is done within Sentinel is done through this concept of a playbook. All a playbook really is an Azure Logic application, or Logic App for short. If you're not sure what a Logic App is or haven't seen one or haven't used one, well, we're going to be going through them today. But also, if you've ever used a tool like Flow or Power Automate, you'll note the experience is almost exactly the same. The big differences between something like Power Automate and Flow or Playbooks and Sentinel is the triggers, and then also the ability of tying something back to a subscription versus a named user. When I think of a Flow / Power Automate, that's usually tied back to an individual or it's tied back to a team. In the case of Logic applications, though, we can tie it back to a resource group. In many cases, it's going to be the same location where your Sentinel instance resides. And therefore, it's really user-less. And that's really key from a SecOps perspective. We don't want to have something tied back to a service account or a specific user for any of those functions. Today, there's about 400 plus different connectors. I believe they just went past that 400 number a couple of weeks ago. And again, that number applies to both Power Automate as well as Logic Apps. And when we say partner connected solutions, it means these are solutions that are pre-wired within the UI. And I don't want you to just think about, again, when we talked about in our last webinar, don't just think in the constraints of what is or isn't in the UI, right? I know ServiceNow is in there. Another ITSM tool of your choice may not be. That doesn't stop you, though, from using things like REST calls to be able to build them manually. When Microsoft has their connectors pre-plumbed, all they've really done behind the scenes is just make it very easy to consume and work with the different actions that are supported within those vendor APIs. And today we're going to show examples across the board of ones that are both pre-integrated from Microsoft and then even scenarios where they're not. And then obviously we're going to use some additional insights in here. One thing I want to call on this slide, I'm going to be heavily showing community sourced playbooks. I'm a big believer in this new, engaging, rising Azure Sentinel community. So a lot of the things that I do and a lot of things we do for our clients start with the foundation of leveraging some of the public repositories from Microsoft around Sentinel. And I'm going to show you a really easy way of being able to consume all the workbooks they have in a very quick and easy manner. There's also other GitHub repositories. I'll certainly show some out of my own, as well as a couple of other folks in the stack as well. But the big thing here is just driving this behind the community. And again, there's a very quick rising community around this. The other piece is, again, around orchestration automation. So, really the whole plan behind this concept of a playbook is I'll call it a enterprise if this then that. If anyone's played with kind of that consumer-based portal where you can say, when I drive away from my house, turn off the lights, lock the door, etc. That's really what a Logic app is doing. And what it's doing is being either fed by an analyst and saying, hey, run this, or it's being fed as the result of an alert firing. So in many cases, it can be, if I see this, automatically do this, or when an analyst says, run this, go do that. And the goal is I want to take in, though, all the details on that incident or that action, or incident or that item, and I want to be able to take different properties of that and then go execute them on some system. So a lot of what I'm going to show today, we're going to really build some playbooks from the ground up, as I'm going to show you what the contexts of some of those different data points are and why they become important. This also means that we can integrate our incident management within Sentinel with other third-party security products. Again, some of them have open APIs that are pre-connected, some don't. This also means ticketing system. And also this is the same mechanism for like alert egress outside of an ITSM platform. So for instance, if I want to send an email, if I want to post to Teams or Slack, if I want to send a text message, a Logic application is also how that event egress goes to an analyst or a team of analysts. All right, I'll come back to this slide later, but let's go ahead and kick some things off here. So you should see my Azure Sentinel view here. I'm on a wide screen, so you'll see it's a little bit probably wider than you would normally see in your tenant. But there's a couple of things I want to talk about and show kind of right out of the gate. And again, today's going to be extremely hands-on. So the first thing I want to highlight is the playbooks. So you can see in this specific tenant that I'm working in, there are numerous different playbooks that have already been imported. Really what I want to start, though, is go through what an initial playbook creation looks like. And we're really going to, again, start from kind of the ground up here. So from this perspective, we're going to go ahead and grab a new playbook. And this is going to provision an Azure resource. This Azure resource is a Logic application, as you can see here. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and choose the subscription, the resource group. I'm going to go ahead and put in demo 1 as the name for the time being. And also we can log the activity from this Logic app out to the workspace. And this is good for logging when a playbook is failing or when something's not parsing correctly, et cetera. I'm not going to do that for this demo one, but we're going to go ahead and create this. So I'm going to go ahead and create that. Should take just about 5 seconds or so. It'll say it's completed. And then we will kick over into our playbook view in Sentinel and start taking a look at what it looks like to work with a Logic app right out of the gate. So here I'm going to go back to the screen over here. We're going to go ahead and hit refresh. And we should go ahead and see my demo 1 playbook here. Great. All right. This is kind of our blank slate of how and what we want to start integrating. Again, start with kind of our if this then that. So I'm not going to solve a problem initially. Let's just go through and build out what an example would look like, within Sentinel today. And when you first get into a logic application, you first have to define what a trigger is. And a trigger is going to be one of many things. In most cases with Sentinel, a trigger will be an event. So in many cases, if not almost all that you work within Sentinel, one of the first things I'm going to do is just create a blank app. And you're going to see automatically, because I'm creating this in the context of Sentinel, you're going to see Sentinel highlight up here at the top, also because I have recently used that as well. So when I click on the trigger of Sentinel, you're going to see two different options. So one is when a response to an Azure Sentinel alert is triggered, which is actually what I'm going to use. This one down here is currently private preview, so I'm not going to touch on that today. But this is really the most important one. And when you configure this, this is essentially saying when I fire an alert to this logic app, or when an analyst hits run, take that data in, right? So that's the trigger. Other trigger types that you can also do, we just discard this. You can also do triggers based on recurrence. I can do triggers based on other functions and other sources or services. I can do based on timers. And I'm going to show you a couple examples of like how to use recurrence as an example, because I may want to check a service every 5 seconds, or I may want to go look for something at hourly intervals. Those are different examples of where you could use other types of triggers. So we're going to go ahead and go back and pick out. Bear with me 1 second there. Go ahead and start a new one here. All right, so let's go ahead and build out one of our playbooks here. Sorry, I'm having a portal issue on the view right now. You can see just all the different ones in here, but still, again, we're going to go back to this one. All right, so first things first. Now, because I'm in a tenant where I already have an account configured, we do leverage a non-user named account that has access to different services. And you may do this with your relevant service accounts. In my case, I have a service account for Azure Sentinel so that I can programmatically get data back from or push data back to. So one of the first steps you would see in your tenant, if you have not gone through the creation of this before, is you'll likely see something that looks a little like this. And there may or may not be connections listed. What you essentially have to go through and do is the initial authorization of the account. And again, there are prerequisites around the RBAC and what you would need within the Sentinel instance. Just know that I've already completed that for all intents and purposes here. So the next thing is I've got this event, right? So I could just stop here, but let's go ahead and I want to be able to get some different pieces of information. So really quickly there, what I did is I went over to this operation and you see all these different, pre-can solutions I've used recently, or I can go over here to all and, see all the different ones in Microsoft's catalog across different solutions. Or I can go type in one like ServiceNow and should bring up the different ServiceNow events. Should be the full word here. And again, you can see different examples of that. We're going to keep on building this out, so I'll get into some of those in just a second. So let's go ahead and do Sentinel, and then here are all the actions I can integrate with Sentinel. Again, this is really where the pre-plumbed versus kind of build it on your own comes into play. So in this case, you can see that programmatically I can do things like use this to add a comment to an incident, add a label, get the incident details, get the description, the severity, the status, the title, entities that are within an incident. So if an event is generated based on a user account or an IP, that's an entity. So I could then get all entities of IP associated with that incident, because maybe I want to get that use that IP to go get additional details. And then I can also do things like remove labels as well. In this case, and I'm getting a couple questions on zooming in. So for anyone that is attending the session, you can right click and there should be a zoom option, but I will go ahead and pivot over to a different screen. Just bear with me 1 second. Thanks for those that mentioned this. I'm gonna move over here. It is accurate. These are 31 inch screen or 34 inch screens. So I know that can be small in some cases. All right, this should be a bit better. If anyone wants to chime in the Q&A section, feel free for 1 second and we'll get things moving again. It's about the smallest I can make it at this point, or the largest I can make it at this point. Okay, and again, I will have to pivot back and forth between some different screen shares, so this will make it a little bit more difficult, but bear with me. So in this case, this is our playbook. So we have the different entities. So one of the biggest things is when I push something over to Logic Apps, I need to get some additional details. In this case, I want to be able to get all of the incident information. So one of the first things I need to be able to get is the incident, and I need to get that with a variety of different fields here. And I'll show you what this looks like in just its raw form here in just a second. So the first thing I need to do is I need to define a subscription ID. And if you've ever worked with APIs, all I'm really doing is defining the fields for the authorization here. Here we'll go over into the resource group. Here we'll go over to the workspace ID. And by the way, when I'm selecting these values, it's selecting the items that are being fed from that push or from the pull, depending on the event, the type of trigger you're doing. So I don't have to put in the sub ID or the resource group name. I'm going to get that fed over automatically from that connector. So again, this is these are dynamic fields based on that. And then my last one is going to be alert ID here. And we will do our system alert ID. Okay, so I'm going to stop here, and we're going to really step through building this out. So let's go ahead and save this. And we should be saved successfully. So right now, all I'm doing is saying, hey, when there's an alert triggered, get the details of the incident. That's it. But this is going to be the important step because I may need details from that incident to pass through everything else I do from here. So let's go back into this Sentinel instance we're using here. And I'm going to go ahead and just go pick up on a incident down here. So here's an incident. This can either be triggered based on the incident type or from an analyst perspective. I'm going to show from an analyst perspective because it's something we're doing manually today. So in the guise of an analysis here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over and hit View Playbooks. And in this case, you're going to see all the playbooks that are my tenant. So I'm going to go ahead and choose put demo in the search. And then we're going to go ahead and hit Run. Now, again, very, very simple runbook here, but we're going to go ahead and take a look at exactly what it did there, which should be just getting the core incident details, which is really step number one. Sorry, just pivoting around here for 1 second to have another tab open. So if I actually go into that, that Logic app, which is again passed through here, and go to demo one, you'll actually see that runbook succeeded. Perfect. Well, that tells me what I need to know. Everything looked good, but let's see exactly what happened during that. So what happened is, as an analyst, when I pushed the alert out to that to this playbook, it passed through some inputs here, and I can see the raw inputs here and the details that are up in the product name, the severity, the alert display name, and some other basic details. And again, if you remember, those functions I set up for the inputs, the sub ID, the resource group, the workspace ID, the alert ID, guess what's in that request that got pushed over? All of those items. Perfect. So specifically, I'm getting that specific incident, and here's all the really nice outputs that come as a result of that. And here I can click on Show Raw Outputs, and this is the JSON if you ever want to see what's behind the scenes of that. But I'm not interested in the unpretty formatting. I really want to go into having that in a nice formatted way. So what's cool here is, again, I was able to parse and get those events out. That was a new incident. It was an authentication failed during a strong auth request. This was the description of the event, the start, end, and updated time, and then the severity and other related alert IDs. So again, cool. That did really what I want at the most baseline level. So let's keep on building upon this a little bit more. So I'm going to go back up to the Logic application and hit Edit. And let's think about what we want to do next. So here's a scenario where I may want to go ahead and block this Azure AD or block this user in Azure Active Directory when this event type occurs. Or maybe I want to be able to get that IP address and block that IP within my firewall or within conditional access. So one additional step I can take is I can say, okay, well, let's go back into the Sentinel actions I can do. And if you remember, there's this really fancy get IP entities. Now, in this case, again, I'm in my next step here. And again, I don't want to have to put something statically in. So I'm going to go over here and type in entities, and it's going to pass through the entities in this incident that was already gotten. So again, think of these as a chain of events. So here's the alert. It's getting the incident details. This is then getting the IPs in this incident under this alert ID. So again, we're just kind of working down this as we go. So again, I could save that, and then essentially this is going to parse out the IPs. And if there's multiple IPs in an incident, which there can be, there would potentially be multiple events. So then let's go ahead and start a new step here. And I want to just do a control. Now, control allows me to do different conditions and functions. If you've ever worked with PowerShell or any programmatic language before, this should look and feel comfortable. But let's do a condition. So I want to say if this IP, if one of the IP addresses equals 1.1.1.1, if it's true, do this. If it's false, do this. So if it's true, let's go ahead and say with Sentinel, let's go ahead and add a label. Wrong button there, sorry. So in this case, we say if it's true, we're going to go ahead and take the sub ID that was already provided in this. We're going to go ahead and take the resource group. We're going to take the workspace ID. Again, nothing I have to know. I'm just feeding these in from previous incidents. I'm going to go ahead and use the incident in this case, and then we'll go ahead and pass through the incident number. Perfect. And then we'll say it's true, or we can say this IP was found to be a match. All right. And then if it's false, maybe we just do nothing, which is pretty common. You don't always have to do something. So I'm just going to keep this in the most basic form as is. And what we're going to do is we're going to go back and rerun the playbook we already ran. So if you remember, I'm already back over in this incident. So here we are in the same incident. I don't even have to refresh if I don't want to. I will just because, and then I'm going to hit run again. So now remember, because we modified that logic application, we will get the new action. You can see it succeeded here in 1.04 seconds. And voila, so now we can actually see that this went ahead and retrieved the IP address as a part of that incident. So now we can use that IP address in other things that we may want. Now what's cool is in this historical view of this logic app, I can see, if you remember that if condition, the IP was not 1.1.1.1, therefore it was false, and it did whatever was in the false branch, which is nothing. So, you know, one thing I just want to pause, like I don't want to take away from anything you may be comfortable doing in PowerShell or C# or Python, et cetera today. You know, how I see this is it's a really great visual way to work with different APIs. That's really fundamentally what a logic application breaks down to. So again, this may not feel and look comfortable to everyone, but especially if you're not comfortable working in a programmatic language or RESTful APIs, certainly this can be a path forward for you. So, all right, this is a great first step here. I just really wanted to talk through building some from scratch. Now, what I'd like to dig into is a couple of different scenarios. So one is I want to start by pointing out the Microsoft GitHub repository. So one important link here, and you can find this by just looking in Bing for Azure Sentinel GitHub. Yes, I said Bing. And what you'll get taken to is Microsoft's GitHub repository that's sourced and managed by the product group. And you'll see a bunch of different things in here that are committed all the time, as recent as like 8 hours ago. And one of the areas that we're going to focus on today is this Playbooks area. Now, you don't have to know or be comfortable with GitHub here. Just understand that these are playbooks that have been either sourced by the product team within Microsoft or other engineers in their global security operations center, but also you can publish your own playbooks out to this as well. And Microsoft, once they review them with the right criteria, will be committed and then be available and open to the public. And that's for anything in GitHub for those that aren't familiar or comfortable with it today. So one of the things that I always recommend is starting out with what's in the Microsoft GitHub repository, because it's logic and it's effort. I don't have to go back and rebuild. So I'm going to walk through a couple in the portal today, and then I'm going to give you a trick on how we can even bring these in much quicker than having to click through 30 or 40 different runbooks in the portal and importing them. So I'll pick just a couple here. So let's take this block Azure AD user. So what does it look like to deploy something from the Microsoft GitHub repository? Well, it's very straightforward. You'll see that every playbook, it's required to have a README file, which is what you see here, and then the Azure deployed JSON file, which is something that someone who builds a runbook can export, or you can export your own and put them in your own corporate GitHub repository or change control platform. And behind the scenes, when you're working in the UI of Logic Apps, all it's really doing is building this ARM template, which are all these different functions. And you can imagine whether it be clicking through the wizards like I was going through, or whether it be someone who's really comfortable working with ARM templates or within VS Code. This is a lot of logic I don't have to go build right out of the gate. So let's talk about deploying something from their GitHub repository. Very straightforward. I hit deploy to Azure, and that's going to actually open up the ARM template with the right baseline parameters in it. I'm going to go ahead and choose the resource group, and I'm going to go ahead and put in a username. Very important to note, Microsoft does require that you put a username in their template guides for the playbooks. This username is really not used other than just a tag on the resource object. So this isn't going to be used to connect back to something, or it's not going to be used for an API connection. Fundamentally, it's just a tag on the object. So, while I'm putting my user account, it doesn't really matter what it is. It's not going to be used in any function or automation. So we're going to go ahead and create this one. I already have this guy out there, so I'm not going to finish the creation process. It takes about 5 or 10 seconds to finish that creation. And what we're going to do is we're going to pivot back into what that runbook looks like. And I always recommend, by the way, reading what Microsoft has in the deployment notes as well. They will call out when there are specific requirements for different functions. So for instance, we're going to get in a few minutes and hear what's called a managed service principal, where I don't necessarily want something to be tied back to a user account for automation or a service account, but instead we use what's called a managed identity to do that. You will always see things noted in the notes here by Nicholas or other folks on the team that have committed various details to the repo. So again, nothing really crazy here. And this is also clear on what this does. This playbook will disable the user in Azure AD and add a comment to the incident. Sounds great, right? As someone who's working in Sentinel, I may have a manual processor on doing this today. Why would I not automate this? Either through a function of linking it to an incident or manually running it. So let's go back to our playbooks here, and we'll go ahead and find that one. And it's just called block Azure AD user. There we go. And again, when these come in from Microsoft, just to be clear, they will come in without authorized connections. So where mine have these accounts that show connected to this account or connected to this account, you will, again, just as a reminder, you'll have to provide that account the first run. Or ideally, you already have a pre-configured API connection to reference, which you can always create by either creating a new one or hitting change connection and hitting add new. That's then stored in the API connections area of Azure. And the whole point is I don't necessarily always want to have an account per runbook. It just gets a little bit messy to do that. So I straight imported this. I went ahead and already authorized the connections by just going and hitting change and the add where necessary. Well, let's look at what was already pre-built for us here. And this should look pretty familiar. So this is saying when a response to an alert is triggered, so by an analyst or by linking to an incident, which we'll go back to in a few minutes here. Let's get all the incident details, again, passing through those fields that came from the incident platform. Get the accounts. So this one is specifically different than the IP one. This is saying, hey, let's get the specific account entities. When I say account entity, I mean the UPN of the user, the email address of the user, et cetera. And then for each account, we're going to actually leverage a pre-built Azure Active Directory connector. So just to show you what that looks like really quickly, you can just go up into your operations, and where I mentioned earlier that Microsoft has a whole bunch of pre-canned connectors. Certainly they have a lot in the Microsoft space. So if I wanted to, I can go see what else is available in Azure AD. And you can just start to think about all this automation that I may do today with a manual process or with PowerShell. You can see some of the different functions here. So specifically what we're looking for is this update user. And you may think, well, why update user? Well, specifically because there's this little field here called account enabled. And there's some additional ones here you can use as well. But we're looking at this, and we want to set this as no. So all that Nicholas wrote here when he wrote it is he's just concatenating the name and UPN suffix, which are fields that are passed through in the account details. Again, just to make sure the name standards match what the UPN would be. And then the last thing is they're using the Sentinel connector again to add a comment to the incident saying that this user was disabled via an Azure AD playbook. That's really it. So really 5 steps here for all intents and purposes. You know, the getting the push of the event, the getting the incident details, the accounts related to it, updating that event, and then updating the incident in Sentinel with a comment, or you can even close it if you want to. So really straightforward. We'll go through some other examples, but let's talk about how to kick this off now. So if we go back into Sentinel, there are 2 ways in which you can kick off a playbook, one of which you saw a little bit earlier. On a per incident basis and manually, a SOC analyst can go into any incident, go to view playbooks. Again, this is all if they have the correct rights, and they can go choose, in my case, block AAD user. I am not going to hit run because I don't want to block this user and this tenant. But as soon as I click run, what you saw happen with those other test run books will happen again within milliseconds/seconds. This is not the only way, though, to go ahead and trigger a runbook. We can also do this as a result of an incident or alert rule type. So for instance, if we go back over here and we look for this login from Nigeria. So this is one I built due to some very high login rates we're seeing from Nigeria and Lagos. So what this one is saying, hey, look at all of the sign-in logs where the country is Nigeria, and the result type is a success, which is a 0. And then just extend these fields. You guys should have seen this in the last demo. I'm not going to go through it much more in depth, but note that this runs every hour for the last hour of data, and we're looking for anything greater than 0. What I skimmed over, though, in the past was this right here, which is the ability of coordinating a playbook as a response to this event. So if I wanted to, I can go ahead and check that box. And what would happen is when the alert fires, it will automatically send it over to the playbook. Now, you want to be very careful with playbooks. So kind of my word of warning, make sure that when you consider the usage of playbooks, that they're quantifiable type of events, meaning there's something that I know that if it's A, B, and C, it equals D. Do not use playbooks in a automated fashion unless you can dictate that the criteria that are met are always going to be what the result you want it to be. And be very careful of that. You can imagine what you could possibly do in the wrong types of scenarios here. Even in this example for Nigeria, if there was a club trip to Nigeria and a whole bunch of our salespeople went out there, those salespeople would log on, open their phones for the first time, connect to Outlook, and guess what would happen? It would flag an event and then automatically block their accounts. So it's even why I don't have something like block Azure AD user enabled on this type of incident. And again, this is just one example. There are millions of different combinations of things you can do, if not tens of millions within playbooks. But just word of warning is just be very explicit about what you want to accomplish when you're building a playbook. Okay, so that was one example. We're going to go through a couple more in the portal here. They're going to be slightly different, and then I'm going to go through a couple that I've built as well. So another one that comes to mind is for folks that leverage Azure AD identity protection. So I show this one because it's a bit different in how it interacts with the services, mostly because this one leverages a managed identity, which is different. So we're not tying it back to an account or a user. It uses a RESTful API based on how Microsoft has their interactions with identity protection today. So just like last time, though, you'll see I can hit deploy to Azure. This is clear on the fact that this dismisses the property via Graph API, hence where the permissions can be required for. And we'll need to create a managed identity that's going to be added as a security admin. And I want to show this one because of this function right here and how it's a little bit different. All right, so we've got this playbook here. Let's go back. We're going to pivot back to our playbooks here. We're going to go ahead and look at this one that I've already imported. And you'll see what they're doing in this one. So a couple things to call out. So very similar up top. All it's doing is it's getting the alert, getting the incident type, getting the accounts. In this case, though, what it's doing is actually talking back to Microsoft Graph API with a managed identity, and it's going to go ahead and pull details about the user object and then dismiss this. So this is essentially dismissing a user risk, if you've ever seen this in Azure AD identity protection. And this is where I start to talk about, solutions like identity protection don't have a built-in solution. So this is just a standard HTTP call against the API. So in this case, I'm just doing a post against Graph API, and here is the extent of what you need to put in the body, et cetera, to do that. So that's one important part to show here. So if we back up, though, one of the things I'll show that in order to make this function, we actually leveraged a managed identity. So one thing that's not enabled by default under managed identity is the system assigned identity. And where this becomes really important is when I want to use this in the context of remediation. So I want to give the runbook a role. So not a user, but a runbook a role. So if I actually go over into Azure Active Directory and I go look at who's in our security admins group here, you'll actually see that group, that role, our runbook is actually a part of. So it's not a user, it's not a service account, it's actually the runbook itself. And that's really where a managed identity comes into play heavily. You should see here in a second, I've got a couple of different playbooks actually for dismiss and confirm and identity protection here for teams. So what this is allowing us to do is, because that runbook is a security admin, it can delegate the dismissal of that user, the confirmation of that user, et cetera. So again, you'll see some scenarios like this in some of the Microsoft provided playbooks here that you'll want to make sure that those are set up for. I'll do one more example, and then we're going to talk about how to automate the ingestion of this. So let me go down and just find another good one. So another common one I get as well is that we want to be able to take the messages or the events out into notification channels. In Sentinel today, there is not just a straight notification channel option. The way you do that is through a playbook. So it's often that you may want to egress these events via email or Teams or Slack. In this case, we'll end up showing Teams. And a runbook for that has already been created here called post message to Teams. So again, this is an example of how to get that out. So I've already, again, just like the others, I've gone ahead and deployed that already. I'll just browse back here. Close the wrong tab earlier. All right, so we should be able to see under here in the search, the post to Teams. And what you can do with this one is a couple different things. So I can have an analyst just post to Teams when there's actually something that needs to be addressed. We can post to Teams in an automated fashion every time there's a high priority event. Different options I can do here. And you can see this is pretty basic. This leverages a pre-built Teams connector Microsoft has. You can see here this one when I run it or have it run as a result of an incident, I post something to our Netrix SOC team under the alerts channel. And you'll see it has different details around the event in there. It's just an egress point. Again, same thing could be done for, say, email as well. And again, I can execute that no different than what I showed earlier. If we go back into one of our incidents over here, I can go ahead and then run that same playbook just like all of the others, and then it would post those details to Teams. Or again, I can say with this incident type, post all of these specific details into Teams. And that's, again, a push type method. In addition, though, there are some other great use cases around notifications within playbooks as well. So one of these I'm going to show you is actually authored by, I believe this one is by Rod Trent, who's works within Microsoft today. And this is another example that is, I want to be able to get a daily, weekly, or monthly summary of incidents when I maybe come in for the day or the week, et cetera. So this is actually another great one where this essentially parses via API all of the events that have happened in the last 24 hours, and then it goes ahead and sends me a summarized email in the morning. So I'll pull this up in just a few minutes from an example of mine. This is a really great way of getting those kind of standard emails you would expect or want when you come in first thing in the morning. I also happen to have a runbook set up that'll send me notifications in different channels whenever there's a high type of event. So let me just stop sharing here, and I'm going to reshare my email here. And this is an example of what that pre-can report looks like. And this just gives me all the events that have occurred in the last 24 hours. So again, just another mechanism to be able to get those out. And this is actually a great example because this leverages a different type of trigger. So up until this point, I've primarily, showed the triggers of Sentinel being pushed, Sentinel pushing something. But in this case, this is actually using a recurrent trigger. So here you can see this is actually running every day at 6 a.m. And it's going to go ahead and run a query to get all the incidents, make that into a nice pretty table, and then push that in as an email. So this is a different way in which you can interact and work with a playbook. So again, just another really great example here. All right, so let's talk about how to make some of this a bit more real in your Sentinel deployment. So, first things first is when I look at a lot of the playbooks here, for instance, I'm immediately overwhelmed, right? There are probably 50 to 60 playbooks in here. I don't necessarily want to be the one that's right-clicking, opening in tab and hitting deploy now and then doing that 30 times. So let me introduce you to a solution that we actually built and committed to the public GitHub repo called Add Azure Playbooks or Add Playbooks to Sentinel. So kudos to Tom on the team as well, who helped write a majority of this, and I kind of put the idea out there. So our thought was, how do we really en masse take playbooks that are out there in the wild today in Microsoft's GitHub repo or third-party GitHub repos or local repos on my device and be able to bring them in at scale? So this playbook is essentially going to do just that. And really quickly, what this is doing, it's essentially looking at every playbook in the public GitHub repository by default, and it's going to parse every single one and look for the deployment file. It's going to parse and look for any requirements of additional fields, and then you're going to do kind of this multi-select experience to go ahead and feed those over into the ingestion into Sentinel. So what I'm going to show here is what that actually looks like in action. I'm going to try to do this on one of my smaller screens here so that everyone can see it. Just bear with me 1 second here. So this is the script called Add Playbooks to Sentinel. I've got a copy of this locally. I could run it from wherever I want, really. And we're going to go and execute the script. So the first thing that's going to happen is we first look to get to the GitHub repository. Now, here we go. So I just had to drag it over from a different screen, you can see. So what this is doing is it's just going straight out to the GitHub repo that Microsoft has, and it's parsing every single folder in there and giving me all the playbooks. So what I can do is with this, I can click on different playbooks. So let's say I want that block Azure AD user. I want this confirm Azure AD risk user. I want, we'll pick get IP reputation and reset Azure AD password. So down here, you see this little OK button. So I'm just selecting which ones I want to import. And our next step is to go ahead and authenticate. So I'm going to drag this over and log in as myself. And what we're going to do is we're going to enumerate all the subscriptions that I am a part of and then make those viewable so that the analyst, or in this case, the operator, can go ahead and choose where they want to import these different playbooks. So just bear with me one very quick second here. Just authenticating away here. All right, so I just logged into myself. These are just other B2B accounts that I have, so I'm just going to X out of those. I don't really care about access to any of those tenants. And you'll see here when these other two prompts are complete, that it will have connected as my account to the different subscriptions I have access to in my tenant, which should be, I believe, right about now. So then it's going to actually pop up another box, and I'm going to start to select different details, like what subscription I'm using and what resource group, et cetera, that I'm going to be connecting to as a part of this. And of course, during a live demo, this I did it earlier, and it did not take long. We'll give it a second here. The Azure gods may not be with me today. All right, oh, there we may go. So there it just took some time to authenticate for some reasons. Here we can go back over. And now I get prompted for what subscription that I want to pull this into. So we're going to go ahead and select my internal subscription. And then it's going to ask us the specific Sentinel workspace we want to pull into. You'll see some different Sentinel workspaces here. We'll go into our test one here. And then if you remember, all the Microsoft playbooks require a email address. So we're going to go ahead and plug that in right there. Now, what this is doing is going out and getting all the JSON files and saying, hey, is there anything you need from me other than the username? Some of them will return yes. So for instance, this reset Azure AD password, I'm sorry, this one's actually for the get IP reputation. It requires me to put in a log source name, which is based on the docs, it's just a name of the event type, which is pulling from virus total. So we're just going to call that vtip report. In this case, we need an API key for virus total, and then it's going to go ahead and take and plug those fields in automatically. And now you can go see that I entered in all the requisite fields, and then it's now deploying the playbooks to Sentinel, to my Azure subscription. So this should be done in just a second, and then I will shift back over to my other tenant, and we'll see all of those runbooks en masse pulled right over. There's the third one, and then we should have, I believe, one more. All right, while that's finishing, I'm going to go back, since we're running out of time, I'm going to go back and share my other screen here, and we'll go take a look at what this looks like in action. So this is one of my empty tenants, and in this case, I just finished, by the way. We'll go over to Playbooks, and we will actually see all of our lovely new Playbooks in here in this resource group. There we go. So there is my, there's my block Azure AD user, there's my confirm Azure AD risky user, there's my get IP reputation all in there. And also on the other screen, you can't see it since I stopped sharing that one. You can see that they all completed successfully. So this is now an out of the box runbook from Microsoft. So I can go over into this block Azure AD user one, and you'll see that this is what an out of the box runbook would look like, where I talked earlier about the connections not being authorized. So in here, I can go add a new connection. I can authorize that. I can choose whichever one I need to connect that with. I'm just picking random accounts here. Not all of them have the right access. And then once I'm done selecting those authorized connections, I hit save, and that runbook is now ready to be used. So I highly recommend you review that. This was an idea that we put together. We decided to take to the public rather than just consume ourselves. And again, you can find this out in the GitHub repository under Tools, PowerShell, and then Add Playbooks to Sentinel. We're going to go through a couple more advanced examples. I'm going to leave about the last 5 minutes or so open for questions here. I will also plug Rod Trent's GitHub Sentinel repository. So earlier when I showed that scheduled instant email, that's directly from his. So really friendly plug for Rod, great guy, really helping build up the Sentinel community within Microsoft and externally as well. This is another one that I really love to show. This is really kind of taking security operations to the next layer, right? So we've talked about how to use these runbooks to take different actions. Logic apps are extremely powerful if you haven't found out already today. Other things you can do with Logic apps, I can ask for approval. I can post adaptive cards. I can go ahead and set functions or do switch statements. There's an immense amount of power there. Now, one thing I recommend for everyone that's on the call is don't start by trying to go directly into a Logic app to build something. Sit down with a pen and paper, sit down in OneNote, and document the steps of your desired actions of what you want automated. Make sure you write conditions in there. Like I want it to do this if this happens. I don't want it to do it if this happens. Sit down and write things out first, because ultimately that will translate directly over into you building your own Logic application. And unless you have that clear and it's just in your mind, it's a lot easier to work off of written paper or, again, digital paper than it is an idea. So that's just, again, from doing this so long, that's just one recommendation I have. So I want to show kind of a great example of how to really take, again, security operations to the next level. So Lior is fantastic. There's been some really great playbooks published in the last couple of weeks. And in this case, I want to show kind of a great example of what identity protection with a team's responses. So one of the big things we always talk about is how to consume events in something like any SIM. In Sentinel specifically, do I want to be in a portal? Do I want to do that via email, Teams, etc.? I'm a big proponent of Teams. I prefer to be in Teams wherever possible. Any email in my inbox is bad email. In this case, though, I want to actually leverage the functions of Teams adaptive cards to take action to a security analyst team. So this is a really great solution. What it's doing is essentially going through those same things we talked about, kind of the same 3 basic items. It's going to go ahead and get the risky user information. It's going to compose an adaptive card, and it's going to go ahead and, based on the switch statement, either close the incident or change the severity. But this is really what I think is the most valuable part. And I didn't have a chance to set this up since it was just published a couple of business days ago. But this is an actual event that actually gets an adaptive card sent to a group in O360 or in Teams. This will also be posted to a channel. But let me point out the important pieces here. All of the event details, but specifically I can choose how to respond. And this is really the part that I love. So one is directly in this adaptive card, I can choose the button, I can choose if it's a valid incident. I can also change the severity, but even more important, I can have this kick off an action. So I can directly in the incident say, all right, boom, click that button, confirm the user is compromised, or click that button and dismiss the risky user. So I'm not having to pivot over into an additional playbook, or I'm not having to pivot over into the Azure AD Identity Protection portal. Just think about this in the constraints of any type of alert, where I can really use that, Teams group chat or that Teams channel as my incident management queue to be able to quickly and efficiently resolve incidents, more so than trying to keep that in email. That will not prevent an analyst from going in and looking at all the incident details you see here. But again, just putting some ideas out there on how you can better leverage playbooks in order to better your security operations. All right, well, I went through quite a few examples as a part of today, and really my goal was primarily to focus in on just a foundation of what you can do from a SOAR perspective with Sentinel. So I have a couple of takeaways. I'll show a slide, and then I'll go into the Q&A and see if there's anyone that has any questions. If you do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat now. I'll be addressing them in about 2 minutes here. So a couple of takeaways from this session on SOAR. So again, when we talk Sentinel, the SOAR function is integrated as a playbook and really performed by a logic application, which has connectors to about 400 plus additional applications and services, but also can call any generic RESTful API that is available. Those playbooks can be called either as an on-demand analyst, or they can be called as a result of an alert. And again, you can use these for really just about anything you can think about automating that has some type of API or integration point today. And again, the takeaways, please go check out the Microsoft GitHub repository for Sentinel, specifically the playbook section and the tool section. You'll find our import playbook. Also check out my GitHub repository at Rich 2004, and then also Rod's. All things that I've demoed from these today. And again, I actually didn't get to one of the demos I wanted to show. Last slide here that I want to kind of come back to before I take the final questions are our next section, which is coming up next week. So bear with me while I reshare here. So our final session of our Sentinel series is going to be around advanced hunting workbooks and dashboards. SOAR is definitely my favorite, but this comes a second close. So what we're going to be talking about is really digging into the data next week and how we can leverage all the pieces that are being fed in and ingested from those different data sources and solutions. In addition, we're going to talk about using that data to build workbooks and then also consumable dashboards as well. So how to take this data out maybe for an executive type view. All right, I'm going to go pop over to the Q&A and see if there's any questions. For those that did join, I do appreciate it. I'll do a quick close here in a second. There is a question around, is there a cost to playbooks today? So the logic applications do have a separate cost to them. Generally, they're priced in terms of, I think, sets of 10,000 executions. Your average Logic application that even runs every 5 minutes of every day probably will cost less than 20 cents. Most of your playbooks will usually cost less than $1 or $2 to run on frequent intervals. So there's not a significant cost. There is a cost, but there's not a significant cost associated with the runtime of those Logic applications. There's also another question about integrating with other data connectors. So again, just to highlight, Microsoft has about 400 plus different data connectors today. If there's not a data connector in there for a specific API or solution you work with, you can always leverage the REST option in there, which will allow a post to another RESTful API. Again, this is commonly used for solutions that aren't, your big providers that are already in there, like your ServiceNow, or, if you're not Slack, or you're maybe a smaller chat provider, et cetera. But again, as long as there's a RESTful API and I can accept requests from a system, I can send those over via that mechanism. There's another question around running multiple playbooks. So it is in public preview, I believe, today, but you can link multiple playbooks to an incident, to an automated response. So you're not just tied back to a one-to-one. So I can, for that example, for a Nigerian-based login I showed earlier, at one time it was limited to just that specific incident, only allowing to just block Azure AD user as the response. I believe it is currently in public preview today to select multiple runbooks. So I could block Azure AD user, but also post to Teams, or whatever other function you may want to do. It's a good question. I think that is all the questions we have. Anyone else have any questions? Feel free to drop them in chat. I'll give it about 30 seconds until about 59 after, and then we will go ahead and wrap for today. All right, I am not seeing any questions pop in the chat. Feel free to reach out to myself or our marketing team after the event for any follow-ups. We will post this recording as well, and you'll find a link to all those, and you may also get an email closing as well with those details. So I do appreciate everyone joining the second webinar in our series here, and look forward to seeing everyone on the next one. Take care and have a great week.